This is Canis Rolls Deep with Donkey Kong Country 2 any%. This is my main category of any speedrun, and it's also a staple of past GDQs, something I have experience in running both at AGDQ 2017 and the Harvey Relief Done Quick marathon that recently happened. The timer would begin right now on clicking one player, and this game starts off with a lot of cool glitches. On stage 2, you will be seeing the very first wrong warp, which is coming up, and it's a major mechanic in this game wherein you corrupt memory by transforming a beetle into an invisible object, which will then change a warp barrel into something that shoots you to the end of the level instead of going through a transition towards the goal. So you'll see that right now, going up top to grab this beetle, and we're going to make it an invisible corrupt object, throw it at a certain spot, and bam, you're out of the level. Worlds 1 and 2 have developer intended warps throughout, and we'll be using those. As far as movement in this game, any time not spent rolling is better spent rolling. You want to roll as often as possible, but in order to not lose momentum at the end of a roll, you have to always jump out of it. So you'll see basically a combination of rolls and jumps throughout the game. Coming up is the next wrong warp, which starts out with using the snake readily here for a double jump. Grab this beetle, turn it invisible, throw it at a very particular location, and you're out. Crow here is the first boss and the only major element of luck in the game. For the second phase, his eggs can either be real eggs, which you can use to hurt him, or fake eggs, which do nothing. It's about a 50% chance of either. So here, this is a real egg, but I believe right now you're about to see a fake egg, which costs a few seconds, but not too big a deal unless you get a ton of them. Coming up is yet another wrong warp. This time, instead of using a beetle, however, we're going to use this barrel guy, who's called a clobber. Jump on him with this chest, he becomes invisible. And then, now when we throw into this warp up here, immediately takes us out of the level. Now comes the first instance of the big boy mechanic, which is essentially when you team throw at an enemy, you can get a second jump in the air. One mechanic I haven't mentioned so far is called goal swapping. In this game, if you land on a goal post with enough height, you'll trigger an animation, essentially, of playing a guitar solo or beatboxing. And we don't want to see that, although right here you'll see is the forced scenario of that. But what we want to try to do is jump on the goals without a lot of height so that we don't trigger that animation. And we can also optionally press the select button as we go past the goal to switch Kongs at the same time that we hit the goal. So we'll see that a lot throughout the game, as there's various situations where you want to be Diddy and various where you want to be Dixie. So right there, press select. Now Diddy's in front for the next level. So this is the last level with developer intended warps. So from here on out, the game is going to get a lot more interesting. Again, goal swapping to Dixie right there. Coming up here is Cleaver, which I would say is the first place where there can be some risk. We have this big lava pit here that's actually somewhat easy to fall into when you do techniques like that, where you jump onto the sword to bounce off of him. He's essentially split into two phases. At the end of the first phase, which is this hit right here, we're now going to do a trick called Lava Fly, wherein you can hover all the way to the other side of this lava pit, so it's very precise, easy to die to. Don't believe that was actually developer intended. Just trying to hit the sword as soon as it becomes vulnerable. And here's the classic Flying Diddy technique for the fans. So Barrel Bayou, the next level coming up, is the first level where we actually play from start to end. It's a bit more like the typical level you can expect to see throughout this run. Lots of really cool roll jumping. We also grab Rambi the Rhino here, whose charge technique is way faster than you can normally move. Although you're very limited in how far you can go with it, because before you know it, you'll get to the no Rambi sign, which forces you to dismount the Rhino. Trying to optimize the distance of every roll. This team throw right here actually sets the Kongs into a somewhat glitched state, where the next time I take damage, I'm going to get a big jump out of it, which then allows Dixie to flutter all the way over this long pit. And on to Glimmer's Galleon. This level here is well known as being deceptively difficult. Essentially, every time you touch a wall or bonk a corner unintentionally, you lose up to 2 seconds actually if you completely lose your momentum. So to get a good take on this level, you have to dodge all the walls and corners as best you can. I do believe in this PB we got a pretty good Glimmers. Trying to cut the corners as tight as I can. Getting over this eel can be a bit tricky without getting hit. Cutting the corners. Yeah, so far basically no mistakes in this Glimmers, which is somewhat rare. Went a little too wide there, so lost a little bit of time. But haven't really blonked on anything. This next series of corners are pretty tricky to get through without touching, but we did it. And coming up next is probably the most challenging goal swap that I talked about earlier. You have to squeeze between the goal and this spiny, just barely in between there, and press select to switch Kongs as we exit the level quickly. Coming up here is the most interesting addition to this game since it was last seen at a GDQ, and that's a new wrong warp found in this level that skips the second half of the level. The setup for it is very unintuitive. Essentially what we're going to do is throw Dixie to take damage from this guy at a very particular time as we go into this barrel, which for whatever reason means you beat the level, so GG. Going on to Rattle Battle here, we get to use our buddy Rattly the Snake. And this level is definitely a strange one. There's no other level quite like this, which means it kind of needs its own, series of practice to get good at. But the main thing here is to just try to keep all momentum and not get hit by any of the terrible hitboxes in this level. Mostly just a matter of getting used to being able to predict when you're about to take damage. So yeah, there I realized that if I had kept my momentum, I probably would have gotten hit. So I stalled just a tiny bit. Actually, one of the biggest mistakes in the whole run so far. There are several levels in this game where it's all about using one of the animals that you transform into. And those all require the most practice, I think, because there's completely different mechanics than you normally use for the rest of the game. It's kind of its own skill set that you need to work on. Slime Climb probably has one of my favorite tricks here. I go into the water on purpose, which sets up a glitch that the next time I take damage, I get a really big jump. And then from here, I do another wrong warp using these beetles. And jump off here. The water is despawned from that big jump at the beginning. Throw it, and we're out. Bramble Blast is pretty much just a maze of barrels, and once you know where to go, it's not too bad. Though the timing on some of these is a little bit difficult. If you don't do it just right, the barrel will spin past where you want it to be pointing. And you'll have to wait for it to circle back around. But we got all of the so-called quick shots there, which is good. Coming up, we do a damage boost to switch to Diddy, as well as get past the speed right here. And now we're going to do what's called Vine Clip. Pretty tricky trick where you can throw right between that little area right there. A small window, but if you get the big boy technique, which gives you an extra big jump, and go just to the right spot in those vines, you can throw right through them. This boss will be an excellent time for donations, as it's about 1.5 minutes long. There's not a whole lot to talk about, though I would point out that the technique here is to stand in a certain spot, count Dixie's breaths, and use that as a cue for when to move, such that Cudgel here is facing left as you run to the right side of him. Somewhat precise timing. If you do so, you can basically hit him the instant he's vulnerable. If you were to do a regular throw from the side of the screen, it would be much harder to time. And at each phase, I'm counting for a different number of breaths from Dixie. So that last one I counted to the 3rd breath. This time it's 2, 1, 2. And finally this one, you want to move almost as soon as you pick up the barrel. It's like half a breath. Boom. So that's World 3. It's the first world that actually requires a lot of effort to get good at. Coming up here is World 4 that I think might be the hardest in the entire game. For several reasons that we'll get into, but first off is Hornet Hole. This level is just very tricky movement. Jumping off of the honey smoothly takes a lot of practice, as you need to be able to wiggle right and left while jumping with very precise timing to not sort of get stuck on the honey. Taking damage on purpose there to get a boost up here and switch to Diddy. Grabbing Squitters the spider, which is kind of out of the way, but by using this hook, we more than make up for the fact that he was out of the way by getting this trick called Scrolly Scroll. This is essentially just surfing the camera until you take damage, at which point the glitch cancels. Which you gotta do, otherwise you wouldn't be able to continue back to the left here, as the camera continues pushing right. But yeah, pretty fun level overall. Swapping to Diddy here. Going into Target Terror. This is the first real auto-scroller of the game, and a good break for runners to sort of gather their wits. So even though World 4, I did say, is possibly the hardest world, it does have 2 auto-scrollers in it. So that just kind of tells you how difficult the other levels in this world actually are. Still be the hardest world with these auto-scrollers in it. But this level would be a very ideal time for donations. There's really not a whole lot to talk about. Right here though, and skip bouncing on that dragonfly right there. One of the very few, very minor time saves you can do in this level. I'd also point out that you want to jump from cart to cart as soon as you possibly can. Coming up right now, we skip another dragonfly, saving just a little bit more time. Now for one of my most famous tricks in the game, called Swag Balloon. Totally optional balloon. Cannot save time, but you can lose significant time if you miss it, but it's fun to grab. Ramble Scramble here is probably the hardest wrong warp to do in the game, saving about a minute. You have to climb this rope in a very particular way. Grab the beetle while invincible, jump into this corner here, which allows you to turn it into an invisible object with very precise timing. Throw it over this box. The bonus sends you out of the level. Now to another auto-scroller. This one's a bit more challenging in that we're moving twice as fast, and we have these other racers to deal with. Optimization for this level simply involves jumping down any significantly sized slope, but riding up the upslopes. For whatever reason, in this level you gain speed as you're going up. That guy right there is notoriously difficult for new runners. It's very easy to bounce into him and end up falling into a pit. Coming up next is Mud Hole. I do want to preface it as being tied for the most difficult level, which is actually one of the main reasons I say World 4 is so difficult. Mud Hole has a wrong warp that's pretty hard to do in it. However, it also has about 30 seconds of the most difficult platforming in the entire game. So let's see how that goes. You can already tell you roll over gaps with pretty tricky timing. Here it looks like I'm about to die, but not quite. So you roll under the water to keep rolling speed for as long as possible. This section right here is just devastating. We gotta roll over that. Do a really tricky roll jump there, staying underneath the vultures, and then we culminate in rolling underneath Midway Barrel. All very tricky to time. That's pretty much the hard part of the level over with. A couple more things we gotta do here. Turn left to manipulate the camera, having this barrel spawn later so you can jump over it. Jumping over the cannon with this cannonball to begin setting up a wrong warp with these beetles. Once we throw the invisible object, we grab the cannonball, jump in the cannon, and we're out. Ramby Rumble here is also a pretty difficult level, but for different reasons. You're unlikely to die here, but to get the optimal movement and tricks is pretty hard. Here we're taking damage mid-throw on purpose to get a boost up to that hook, which actually skips a large portion of the level. And just like that, we're about halfway through the level. That is definitely the more challenging half of the level. Bonked on the wall a little bit there. Probably the first mistake in World 4. Then we have a rhino section, which, although is a lot easier than it looks, it's not to be underestimated because you can lose a lot of time due to not starting your charges optimally. You want to start holding A the instant you land, and then stop holding A the instant the charge is fully charged up. which can take some time to get used to judging the animation of the Rhino to know when it's actually time to start charging. Now for the World 4 boss. I know casually this boss was a complete nightmare. I think it took me like a whole day to beat as a kid. But now it's not too bad, as you can get him on a predictable cycle where you know exactly where you need to shoot your projectile at him for each phase. Don't even really have to look at the bee anymore, you just kind of look at where the bird is and you'll know when you need to shoot. So we do have a phrase in the community which is, "Don't sleep on the king." Even though this boss is not too bad once you get used to it, people have a tendency, including myself, to sort of turn off their brains while fighting him. But fortunately that did not happen here on this PB. World 5 is definitely my favorite world here. It's the most pure world as well. There are no wrong warps, just insane platforming and really great vibes, great music. I like the light shining through the trees a lot. And as far as the gameplay, it's actually the most likely world to die in, which makes it fun actually, although frustrating at times. This world is full of pits everywhere, all kinds of places you can fall to your death. So, and that's going to get harder and harder as the world goes on. Here we get a nice long roll through 4 enemies. Ooh, almost missed that rope. And a technique called a plink to jump on that goal without actually jumping. If I were to jump from the rope above, that would trigger the beatboxing. Here comes another auto-scroller, though as a runner this is the most interesting auto-scroller for me. Because unlike the other auto-scrollers, there's actually a lot you can do to speed this one up. I can't exactly explain the science behind it, but if you jump at very particular times in this level, that will save frames, which add up to several seconds throughout the level. You see me doing a lot of seemingly random jumps. They all have a purpose, essentially following what the task does. And as you can also clearly see, it's not required to grab all the plus barrels, and you don't have to dodge all of the minus barrels either. So I tend to not even really look at those. I'm just looking at the layout of the track to decide when to jump, and not even worry about the fact that I hit that right there. I know I'm going to have enough time. Jumping over these bees is actually kind of hard even for an experienced runner. They just have really weird hitboxes. You have to get a lot closer to them than you would think before you jump. Generally, the rules of thumb in this level are jump up the slopes, jump down any slope that's significant in height. But then there's a lot of weird moments, like right here, like you jump for seemingly no reason there. Here you jump for no reason, but there is actually a reason. For whatever reason, saves time. So now becomes the gauntlet of World 5. Essentially 3 levels with increasing difficulty that are all very hard, culminating in Web Woods, which is tied with Mudhole for the hardest level in the game. This level's wind mechanic does make it a little bit scary, but the main concern here is just don't let these ledges basically clip you. What you can have happen is when you roll off the ledge, sometimes your roll will not get the kind of speed that you would expect due to something weird about the ledge physics, and you want to make sure you avoid that so that you don't end up finding yourself in a pit. But with experience, you can avoid getting clipped by those ledges pretty consistently. Matter of essentially rolling from a certain distance from the ledge. Here's a fan favorite right here, Parachute Panic. Essentially we're skipping all of the purple parrots that you're supposed to ride and just kind of doing the level as Dixie. It's not as hard as it looks, but at GDQ we will pretend it's insanely hard and definitely impress the audience, get some donations. I'd say this part right here is the trickiest. We gotta wiggle around that bee, do a quick hover, land on the platform, roll off of it, jump just between those two guys right there. Then here we take damage on purpose, launching Diddy down through those bees with invincibility frames. Completing the level in under 50 seconds. Then here comes Webwoods. I warned you about it before, but this is tied with Mudhole for the hardest level in the game. It might even be the hardest, period. Also, like I mentioned before, it's a level using basically an animal that is mostly unique to this level. You don't really use the spider anywhere else in the run. So it's like almost learning it your own, like a new video game. Completely different set of mechanics that you have to master, and it feels nothing like any other level, so it requires a ton of practice. But cool thing about this spider is if you take damage, you actually have a few frames where you can jump. Right there, I jumped. So that allows you to skip some parts by damage boosting, but it's pretty risky. Coming up here is called the Eagle Pit. I think this is the scariest part of the whole game. You did it. Basically, those webs probably made it look kind of easy, but the webs there, to get them to spawn where you need them to spawn requires extremely tight timing. That's pretty hard as well. It's called the Leap of Faith. But got through that. It all happens too fast to really explain everything that goes on in that level, but it's very nuanced and a lot of crazy stuff goes on. This boss is not to be underestimated. I've definitely lost runs to this boss before. Those two little pits, they're small pits, but you'd be surprised how often runners end up falling in between them. Somewhat difficult to optimize this fight because of the rope sections as well. Climbing ropes in general is one of the hardest mechanics in this game, along with honey jumping. This series of ropes right here takes a lot of practice. You have to climb it the same way every time, or else those eggs won't be where you expect them to be. Makes it very likely for them to hit you. But we got through it, that's the boss. And we survived World 5, most likely world to result in falling to your death. Coming up now is World 6. One of my favorite worlds for sure. Also one that requires some of the most practice. This world has very few ways that you can straight up die, but the difference in a top runner versus sort of an intermediate runner becomes very apparent in this world, as the minor time saves that add up are huge throughout this world. This level alone, again, it's an animal mechanic that's sort of its own video game that you have to master. I've probably practiced this level. It's probably tied for most practice level in the entire game. And it still goes wrong sometimes. Right there, that charge right there, we're supposed to not clip that corner like it did. Still an overall decent level. I'm going to switch Kongs here, duck over the ledge so that we touch the ground, which makes sure we don't get the beatbox animation. Windy Well here starts with what's called a big boy. Again, we team throw and we get a very large jump, which lets us skip a section while off screen. And as a side effect, that also stores a super jump, so that the next time I take damage, I'm going to get extra height. So that's coming up right here. Take damage on purpose by that. Sends me up. I should have grabbed the hook, but I was anticipating going left a little bit too much. One of the biggest mistakes in the entire run, not grabbing the hook. Here we drop the barrel and take damage right after to deboost through that section. And then coming up here is a trick we call ghetto bees, which is simply to say that we go very low in a swooping motion underneath 2 bees in one swoop. Just like that. Pretty scary in run because you take damage here, it loses more time than you would think. You need to go into the next level with both of your Kongs. And if you don't, you have to go into a level you've already beaten to grab a DK barrel. There we go, another mistake. I think that level is probably the worst one in this entire PB. But still a very good run overall. We go into this level with 2 monkeys. And we do that to essentially set up a glitch. It will happen in about a minute. This will be a pretty good time for donations. This is basically an auto-scroller, and all you have to do is not get hit and not lose this barrel as well. The barrel will be involved in the glitch coming up. Other than that, there's some very minor lag reduction things that hardly matter at all. But without this glitch, this level would really be a pain to speedrun because about a 5-minute auto-scroller without the glitch. And ain't nobody got time for that. A lot of people seem to not realize that you can actually set a barrel down once you pick it up by releasing Y and holding down at the same time. Instead of throwing it, you'll just gently place it down. Now we're going to use that mechanic against the wall, which causes it to get crushed by the wall, turn into an invisible object, take damage on purpose, and oh, what's that? That's the goal. Clapper's Cavern here is a little bit of an underrated level. It's pretty easy for something in World 6, but at the same time, it's one of those situations where I think people turn their brains off because they underestimate it and make silly mistakes. So during this PB attempt here, I was definitely making sure to treat it very seriously, be very careful about it, not let any silly mistakes crop up. So far, so good. This technique here is called Throw Your Girlfriend. Throwing her through an invisible invincibility barrel, giving Diddy invincibility as he rolls through all these enemies. For some mysterious reason, Dixie just kind of comes up with you there, hopping out of the floor. And that's that level. Coming up here is another really stressful part of the run. The third from the last level, but it's also one that contains some wrong warp. It can be pretty finicky. So what we're going to do here is grab this cannonball. We're going to use that to jump on the Clapper guy here. Those two things collide with one another to get an invisible object, which summons the cannon, which is actually a fake cannon that shoots you out of the level. Toxic Tower is definitely a favorite among speedrunners of this game. It involves the snake double jump mechanics, which is another one of those things that's sort of isolated to just this one level. But with the double jumps, you can skip massive chunks of this level. So it's the kind of thing that you can't learn in a day or even a week. These double jumps take months of practice to get proficient at. Then we get the Squawks the Bird section. In any percent for this game, it's kind of strange. You don't really get to use Squawks until the very end of the game, even though you can get Squawks a lot earlier in the game. We just happened to skip most of those parts. Like for example, there's a level in World 2 that's all about using squawks. But yeah, the bird is a pretty hard thing to optimize. With a full range of motion in all directions, it kind of increases your need to be super accurate to cut corners. And as you saw, I took a damage boost in the middle of that too, which means any one hit would have ended the run immediately. And there's World 6. So at this point in the game, there's about 5 minutes left. This will be a good time for some last minute donations. We essentially have one level left, and then a somewhat long boss fight. But this level here is sort of the last gauntlet. It's the last thing you really have to worry about in the run, because the final boss becomes very easy with time. But this is kind of tricky. You gotta climb these ropes in a very specific way. I'm going to manipulate the camera to roll through both of these guys. If you were to just hold right, they would definitely hit you. And now we switched... Ooh, my video lagged a little bit. Switch to the bird here, and we fly over the blackbird, which skips the race sequence. And again, it's just trying to really control your motion with the bird. Being able to go in all directions makes it difficult to take the ideal paths to cut corners very tightly. Since this run was on pace to be a huge PB that I'd been working for very long to get, I think I took these corners a little safe. Some of them at least. I did not want to lose this run. Yeah, we got through the last level there, and on to the final boss. This boss requires 9 hits. Essentially, it's just a pattern of dodging fixed attacks of his, and throwing the cannonball at his gun as soon as it starts vacuuming. And for each phase, there's certain tricks and techniques you can do to help ensure that you hit him as soon as he's vulnerable. Or as close as you can get, at least. Yeah, with experience at running this game, it kind of becomes actually difficult to get hit by this guy. So it might be a good time for even more donations right around here, as this is very trivial, almost like an auto-scroller. During a marathon, I would want to do a glitch called Blue Diddy for this next phase. It costs about 6 seconds, so you won't see it here, but you can use these blue clouds to permanently make Diddy blue for the rest of the fight. And it's sort of a marathon staple. Alright, coming up is the last phase. It's about 40 seconds long before the final hit here. But right now I would warn the timers to get ready to hit time, which is going to be as soon as the creme coin that falls from the ceiling touches Diddy. If you're Diddy here, you can outrun the vacuum and not have to worry. Just hold Y and left. If you're Dixie, that becomes a lot harder. The time is coming right about now. There you have it. It's 40 minutes and 8 seconds. Time that far exceeds my initial expectations for myself, but I seem to just never be able to permanently put this game down. Whenever I think I have a PB I like, it continues. So I'd really like to show this category off at the next AGDQ. I really appreciate the committee's consideration, regardless. And I know it's going to be a great event. So looking forward to seeing you all in January. Catch you later.